Hi everyone, it's Cassie, the young teen librarian at East Hampton Library. Tonight we are continuing with reading through Cheaper by the Dozen, and we are continuing with Chapter 11, Nantucket. We spent our summers at Nantucket, Massachusetts, where Dad bought 2 lighthouses, which had been abandoned by the government, and a ramshackle cottage, which looked as if it had been abandoned by Coxey's army. Dad had the lighthouses moved so that they flanked the cottage. He and Mother used one of them as an office and den. The other served as a bedroom for 3 of the children. He named the cottage the Shoe in honor of Mother, who, he said, reminded him of the old woman who lived in one. The cottage and lighthouses were situated on a flat stretch of land between the fashionable cliff and the bathing beach. Besides our place, there was only one other house in the vicinity. This belonged to an artist couple named Whitney. But after our first summer at Nantucket, the Whitneys had their house jacked up, placed on rollers, and moved a mile away to a vacant lot near the tip of Brant Point. After that, we had the strip of land all to ourselves. Customarily, en route from Montclair to Nantucket, we spent the night in a hotel in New London, Connecticut. Dad knew the hotel manager and all of the men at the desk, and they used to exchange loud and good-natured insults for the benefit of the crowds that followed us in from the street. "Oh, Lord, look what's coming," the manager called when we entered the door. And then to an assistant, "Alert the fire department and the house detective. It's the Gilbreths. And take that cigar cutter off the counter and lock it in the safe." "Do you still have that dangerous guillotine?" Dad grinned. "I know you'll be disappointed to hear that the finger grew in just as good as new. Show the man your finger, Ernestine." Ernestine held up the little finger of her right hand. On a previous visit, she had pushed it inquisitively into the cigar cutter and had lost about 1/8 of an inch of it. She had bled considerably on a rug, while Dad tried to fashion a tourniquet and ward inquiries about whether there was a doctor in the house. "Tell me," Dad remarked as he picked up a pen to register in the big book, "do my Irishmen come cheaper by the dozen?" "Irishmen? If I were wearing a sheet, you'd call them Arabs. How many of them are there anyway? Last year, when I went to make out your bill, you claimed there were only 7. I can count at least a dozen of them now." "It's quite possible there may have been some additions since then," Dad conceded. Front boy, front boy, front boy, front boy. You 4 boys show Mr. and Mrs. Gilbreth and their 7, or so, Irishmen to 503, 504, 505, 506, and 507. And mind you take good care of them, too. When we first started going to Nantucket, which is off the tip of Cape Cod, automobiles weren't allowed on the island, and we'd leave the Pierce Arrow in a garage at New Bedford, Massachusetts. Later, when the automobile ban was lifted, we'd take the car with us on the Gayhead or the Sankaty, the steamers which plied between the mainland and the island. Dad had a frightening time backing the automobile up the gangplank. Mother insisted that we get out of the car and stand clear. Then she'd beg Dad to put on a life preserver. I know you and it are going into the water one of these days," she warned. "Doesn't anybody, even my wife, have confidence in my driving?" he would moan. Then, on a more particular note, "Besides, I can swim." The biggest problem on the boat and in the car was Martha's 2 canaries, which she had won for making the best recitation in Sunday school. All of us, except Dad, were fond of them. Dad called one of them "Shut Up," and the other "You Heard Me." He said they smelled so much that they ruined his whole trip, and were the only creatures on earth with voices louder than his children. Tom Greaves, the handyman, who had to clean up the cage, named the birds Peter Soil and Maggie Mess. Mother wouldn't let us use those full names. She said they were Eskimo. Eskimo was Mother's description of anything that was off-color, revolting, or evil-minded. We called the birds simply Peter and Maggie. On one trip, Fred was holding the cage on the stern of the ship while Dad backed the car aboard. Somehow, the wire door popped open and the birds escaped. They flew to a piling on the dock and then to a roof of a warehouse. When Dad, with the car finally stowed away, appeared on deck, 3 of the younger children were sobbing. They made so much noise that the captain heard them and came off the bridge. "What's the trouble now, Mr. Gilbreth?" he asked. "Nothing," said Dad, who saw a chance to put 30 miles between himself and the Canaries. "You can shove off at any time, Captain." "No one tells me when to shove off until I'm ready to shove off," the captain announced stubbornly. He leaned over Fred. "What's the matter, son?" "Peter and Maggie," bawled Fred. "They've gone over the rail." "My God," the captain blanched. "I've been afraid this would happen ever since you Gilbreths started coming to Nantucket." "Peter and Maggie aren't Gilbreths," Dad said irritatedly. "Why don't you just forget about the whole thing and shove off?" The captain leaned over Fred again. "Peter and Maggie who? Speak up, boy." Fred stopped crying. "I'm not allowed to tell you their last names," he said. Mother says they're Eskimo." The captain was bewildered. "I wish someone would make sense," he complained. "You say Peter and Maggie, the Eskimos, have disappeared over the rail?" Fred nodded. Dad pointed to the empty cage. "2 canaries," Dad shouted, "known as Peter and Maggie and by other aliases, have flown the coop. No matter, we wouldn't think of delaying you further." "Where did they fly to, Sonny?" Fred pointed to the roof of the warehouse. The captain sighed. "I can't stand to see children cry," he said. He walked back to the bridge and started giving orders. 4 crew members, armed with crab nets, climbed to the roof of the warehouse. While passengers shouted encouragement from the rail, the men chased the birds across the roof, back to the dock, onto the rigging of the ship, and back to the warehouse again. Finally, Peter and Maggie disappeared altogether, and the captain had to give up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gilbreth," he said. "I guess we'll have to shove off without your canaries." "You've been too kind already," Dad beamed. Dad felt good for the rest of the trip, and even managed to convince Martha of the wisdom of throwing the empty but still smelly birdcage over the side of the ship. The next day, after we settled in our cottage, a cardboard box arrived from the captain. It was addressed to Fred, and it had holes punched in the top. "You don't have to tell me what's in it," Dad said glumly. "I've got a nose." He reached in his wallet and handed Martha a bill. "Take this and go down to the village and buy another cage. And after this, I hope you'll be more careful of your belongings." Our cottage had one small lavatory, but no hot water, shower, or bathtub. Dad thought that living a primitive life in the summer was healthful. He also believed that cleanliness was next to godliness, and as a result, all of us had to go swimming at least once a day. The rule was never waived, even when the temperature dropped to the 50s and a cold, gray rain was falling. Dad would lead the way from the house to the beach, dog-trotting, holding a bar of soap in one hand and beating his chest with the other. "Look out, Ocean, here comes a tidal wave. Brrr, last one in is Kaiser Bill." Then he'd take a running dive and disappear in a geyser of spray. He'd swim under water a ways, allow his feet to emerge, wiggle his toes, swim underwater some more, and then come up head first, grinning and spitting a thin stream of water through his teeth. "Come on," he'd call. "It's wonderful once you get in." And he'd start lathering himself with soap. Mother was the only non-swimmer, except the babies. She hated cold water, she hated salt water, and she hated bathing suits. Bathing suits itched her, and although she wore the most conservative models, with long sleeves and black stockings, she never felt modest in them. Dad used to say Mother put on more clothes than she took off when she went swimming. Mother's swims consisted of testing the water with the tip of a black bathing shoe, wading cautiously out to her knees, making some tentative dabs in the water with her hands, splashing a few drops on her shoulders, and finally, in a moment of supreme courage, pinching her nose and squatting down until the water reached her chest. The nose pinch was an unnecessary precaution, because her nose never came within a foot of the water. Then, with teeth chattering, she'd hurry back to the house, where she'd take a cold water sponge bath to get rid of the salt. "My, the water was delightful this morning, wasn't it?" she'd say brightly at the lunch table. "I've seen fish who found the air more delightful than you do the water," Dad would remark. As in every other phase of teaching, Dad knew his business as a swimming instructor. Some of us learned to swim when we were as young as 3 years old, and all of us had learned by the time we were 5. It was a sore point with Dad that Mother was the only pupil he ever had encountered with whom he had no success.